Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here for this important topic. We're delighted that you're here to join us for Zoom In with JPro, Antisemitism and Allyship. I'm Laura Herman, the Director of Program Evaluation here at JPro. And since October 7th, our communities have been dealing with a sharp rise in anti-Semitic incidents of harassment, vandalism, and assault. Our relationships, both within and outside of our communities, have shifted in this new reality. We're all grappling with a paradigm shift. Most of us have never experienced anything like this before in our lifetime. At JPro, we seek to connect, educate, inspire, and empower all professionals working in the Jewish nonprofit sector. As we begin to understand this post-October 7th reality, we're grateful to Vlad Chaikin, National Director, Programs on Antisemitism, and Tema Smith, Director, Jewish Outreach and Partnerships from the Anti-Defamation League, who will share insights into how antisemitism and allyship are playing out in our new world. Before we get started, I want to address a few quick housekeeping items. For those of you who may just be logging in, please take a moment to rename yourself with your name, your organization, and feel free to add your pronouns to your Zoom name if you wish, so we know how to refer to you. If you need any technical help during our time together, please reach out to JPro Help in the chat. Zoom captioning is available and you can access that at the bottom of your screen. Our program today is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel following the session. We'll also share a list of resources from the ADL with anyone who is registered. Toward the end of our time together, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions to Vlad and Tema, and please submit your questions either directly to me in the chat or through the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And finally, some group norms and expectations. We know that the situation in Israel and anti-Semitism can be difficult to talk about, with deeply personal experiences and heightened emotion. My colleague is going to put our group norms in the chat, and we appreciate your attention to this throughout the program. I'll give you a minute to read that. Lastly, before we begin, I want to recognize that everyone participating in this program comes from a different background and has their own experiences with this topic. For some of you, what's being presented might be completely familiar, and for others, it may be entirely new. We hope that you'll come away with some new insights, no matter what your current level of knowledge might be. And without further introduction, I will pass it over to Vlad to begin our conversation.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for this important and unfortunately very timely conversation. I've got a lot of content that I want to present to you, so I'm going to jump right in. Then after that, I'll pass it to my colleague Tema to speak a little bit about allyship in this moment, and then we'll turn it over to a Q&A. So if you have questions as I am going along, just hold them till the end or put them in the chat so that they can be fielded to us during the Q&A. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll just jump right in. So before we begin the conversation about anti-Semitism, I always think it's important to spend just a minute speaking about whom it targets, right? The community targeted by anti-Semitism, which is primarily Jewish people, right? And like other forms of bigotry, anti-Semitism is partially based in ignorance, right? Ignorance about the community, what we don't understand about their religion, their culture, their language, their way of life, and so on, can create a situation where we fill the void of what we don't know with all of our anxieties and trepidations, prejudices, and biases and so on. So as a first step, I always think it's important to talk about Jewish people and provide some objective information and maybe dispel a few myths and misunderstandings, because there's many when it comes to Jewish people. So the first thing to know is that Jews are not a race, right? Many people think that Jews are a race. This is actually an idea that was favored by the Nazis, that Jews are a separate racial category unto themselves. Jews are not a race, but are a multiracial community of people that come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, backgrounds, socioeconomic classes, and so on. It's a really a diverse group of people that are much more than just a religious group, right? That's the second thing that is often misunderstood about Jewish people. We're more than a religious group. We're an ethno group, or an ethnic group, a people, a nation with a religion that is particular to our group, right? So just to put a finer point on this, in the 2020 Pew study of Jewish Americans, they found that only about 1 in 10 US Jews say that being Jewish is primarily about religion. Most Jews think that religion is an aspect of being Jewish, but it's really also about heritage and culture, tradition, a link to one's ancestors, and many other aspects of Jewish identity. The next thing to understand is that Jews are a global community. We're dispersed all around the globe, right? We not only are today have a Jewish state in the Middle East, but also a diaspora, right, that stretches across the globe, and Jews can be found in most countries around the world due to dispersion, right? Primarily through waves of dispersion by various empires that conquered the ancient state of the ancient sovereignty of Israel, and in some cases dispersed, forcibly displaced Jewish people, and it took them to various parts of the empire. And in those communities, Jews developed their own unique traditions and expressions of Jewishness, and they were developed different identities, sort of subcategories, right? You probably are familiar with some of these, right? Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Beta Israel, B'nai Israel. There's many different Jewish groups all around the world, but Jews consider themselves to be part of one one global community, one people, one sort of global family that draws its sort of identity, that its connection to the Levant, right? The part of the Eastern Mediterranean that is today Israel, Palestine. We consider ourselves to be descended of people that come from that part of the world, that our ethnogenesis, the birth of our culture, our people, our religion, took place in that part of the world. And to this day, the Jewish identity for most Jews is closely related to the land of Israel. Right? There's many ways in which we can see that. For example, religious Jews recite a prayer called the Amidah 3 times a day, and in that prayer there is a supplication for the return of a people to its ancestral homeland. The blessings we say over meals, Birkat Hamazon, also have these words about the restoration of Jerusalem and the ingathering of the exiles back to our indigenous homeland. 613 commandments or mitzvot that are found in the Torah. Many of them cannot be fulfilled outside of the land of Israel. When we think about the Jewish calendar, right, the calendar that we live our lives according to, no matter where we live in the world, that calendar is tied to seasonal and agricultural cycles of the Eastern Mediterranean. So in many ways, Jewish identity remains very closely tied to the land of Israel to this day. Now, when we talk about anti-Semitism in the United States, right, we can study it in a number of different ways to understand its sort of scale, its scope and prevalence, right? And one of the ways to do that is by looking at hate crime figures. Now, there's different categories of hate crime, right, on the basis of what is the motivation that led people to be attacked, right? And anti-Jewish hate crimes are classed in the anti-religious motivation category, right? And in that category, Jews represent a majority of targets, right? In any given year, I think we're anywhere between 52 and over 70% of targets in the anti-religious motivation category, depending on the year. And it's more or less always been the case. Since the FBI started tracking hate crimes back in the 1970s, Jews have always accounted for a majority of the targets in the anti-religious motivations category. Now, when we look across all categories of hate crime, that is, people being attacked for their race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and so on. Jews, who are only 2% of the US population, account in any given year between 8 and 13% of targets across all categories of hate crime. In other words, Jews are overrepresented among targets of hate crime by a factor of between 4 and more than 6x relative to our share of the US population. So if you're a Jewish person living in the United States today, you are much more likely to be the target of a hate crime than the average American. At ADL, we also keep our own set of figures, right? Every year, our team at the Center on Extremism tabulates anti-Semitic incidents across the country. And what we've seen over the last decade is a really drastic explosion, really, of anti-Semitic incidents. From around 750 in 2013 to nearly 3,700 in 2022. And this actually represents the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents on record that we have ever seen. And we've also been tracking this for about half a century, right? So when Laura said at the outset that we are living through a period of anti-Semitism that none of us have ever experienced in our lifetime, the data very much bears this out, right? These are historically high levels of anti-Semitism that we are currently living through. Now, human behavior is shaped by beliefs, right? The things that we believe about our world, about our place in this world, about our relationship to other people with whom we share this world, and so on, right? And so the increase in anti-Semitic incidents we see as being driven by an increase in anti-Semitic sentiment and belief. Right. So as you can see in this chart, we've been tracking anti-Semitic belief and sentiment in the United States since the 1960s. And you can see that over the coming decades after the 60s, we've seen a pretty drastic decline in the share of the American population that believes various kinds of anti-Jewish tropes, stereotypes, conspiracy theories, and so on. Right. But as you can see, over the last number of years, we've started to see a resurgence in anti-Semitism. So that multi-decade pattern of declining rates of anti-Semitic belief in the United States has pretty conclusively now come to an end. And we're really seeing a drastic resurgence in the share of the American population that is extensively infected with anti-Jewish beliefs. Now, despite all of this, despite this explosion of anti-Semitism, as a phenomenon, it remains very poorly understood. Right. So a few years ago now, there was a poll conducted that found that about half of Americans said that they either have never heard the word anti-Semitism or don't know what it means, can't define the word, right? So we've really got our work cut out for us. And my mission today is to impart to you some important understandings about anti-Semitism so that you really complicate your thinking about this phenomenon and really have a more sophisticated understanding than the majority of the US population and I would say the human population in the world more broadly. So what is anti-Semitism? So there's many different definitions, and over the last number of years, there's some new definitions that have come onto the scene. Just a quick note about definitions is that obviously they're very fraught, they're contentious, and they're also should not be considered, no single definition should be considered as like authoritative or comprehensive, right? Anti-Semitism as a phenomenon, as we'll see, is very fungible, and it's always shifting and adapting and shape-shifting. So it's no definition is ever going to capture all the iterations, permutations, and manifestations of anti-Semitism. But here is one definition that we use at ADL. But again, it should only be considered as a kind of useful guide, right, rather than anything that is comprehensive. So anti-Semitism can be understood as the marginalization and or oppression of people who are Jewish or are perceived to be Jewish, based on the belief in stereotypes, myths, and disinformation about Jewish people, Judaism, Zionism, and Israel. Right, so pretty straightforward definition. Now, when we talk about the various stereotypes, myths, and disinformation about Jews, Judaism, Zionism, and Israel, there are many, right? Anti-Semitism has been around for a very long time. It's sometimes referred to as the oldest hatred. I don't think that's quite right. that title probably goes to misogyny, but it's probably the oldest ethnic hatred. And so over the centuries that it has existed, it has picked up, it has sort of snowballed and picked up new ideas about the Jews, new associations, tropes, stereotypes, etc. But they can generally be categorized into a number of different categories. So I'll put them on screen now, and we'll just talk about them briefly. So first of all, deicide is the idea that Jews bear responsibility for the murder of Jesus Christ, the embodiment of God's presence on earth, the representation of all that is good and just and holy and pure and righteous and moral, right, etc. And who are the Jews? The people to whom Jesus came first with this beautiful message. And what did the Jews do? They not only rejected Jesus's beautiful message of peace and honesty and goodness, they then murdered Jesus, right? And what kind of a people would do such a thing? First of all, a very evil people, but secondly, also a very powerful people, right? Who can literally murder God incarnate. Must be a very powerful group of people. And so as a result, you get various different kinds of conspiracy theories that develop over the following centuries that are specifically around this notion of Jews as a malicious power in the world, right? An inordinate power that is used for malicious purposes. Next category is the blood libel, another ancient trope about Jews. And this has both literal forms and figurative forms, right? Like many of these. So literally, the notion that Jews perform human sacrifices or drink the blood of non-Jews, particularly children, or use them in various kinds of demonic ceremonies, such as Passover, the Passover Seder, where the blood is baked into a matzah, etc. Right? But then there's also figurative forms of this, where it's not literally that Jews drink the blood literally of non-Jews, but rather that Jews are bloodthirsty. Right, and we see this a lot in the present moment as Israel is waging this war against Hamas in Gaza. You see this notion come up about Jews as bloodthirsty, as warmongers, right, as aggressors, all of this kind of thing, as intentionally targeting children and all of that sort of thing. Next category is disloyalty, the idea that Jews cannot be trusted to be loyal citizens of the countries where they live, that Jews are potentially a fifth column, right, that live amongst us but really want to do us harm, that they have, that they're a foreign element, right, who are not quite of us and given the chance will betray us, all those various kinds of notions. And during periods of heightened a perception of heightened threat to the nation, its borders, its constitution, its way of life, etc. This particular trope will tend to put Jews in harm's way, right? When Jews are represented as being hostile, a hostile element that is, is a threat to our way of life, our borders, our constitution, etc. Related to that trope is the idea of Jewish dishonesty, right? The notion that Jews cannot be trusted to mean what they say, that Jews are liars, deceivers, manipulators, that Jews are two-faced, right? That Jews have ulterior motives, and so on. And we see this again a lot. This notion of epistemic anti-Semitism, right? The notion that Jews cannot be trusted to be honest and forthright testifiers, even when it comes to their own oppression, even when Jews are targeted for murder, they cannot be trusted to testify and to bear witness to that oppression, to that murder, rape, etc. Again, something we've seen, a dynamic we've seen playing out over the last couple of months. The common notion of Jewish greed or avarice, right, of Jewish materialism, the idea that Jews are primarily motivated by material gain, that Jews are avaricious and greedy, that Jews have inordinate wealth also that they wield in malicious ways to bribe people, to undermine the political process, and so on. Right, and this notion generally that wealth that Jews have is ill-gotten, right? It's been attained through dishonest means. And the last category is again a broad category that has many different forms: Holocaust denial, abuse, misappropriation, inversion, and so on. Various different kinds of ways that this manifests, from hardcore Holocaust denialism, the idea that the Holocaust was entirely invented, never happened, it's a hoax created by the Jews in order to XYZ, some nefarious ulterior motive, right? Either to fleece Germany for reparations or steal Palestinian land, various kinds of notions as to why the Jews invented the Holocaust. So that's hardcore Holocaust denialism, but it also takes the form of what scholars have called softcore denialism, which is well, yes, Jews were killed, but only a few thousand, not millions, or some notion like that. You also get misappropriation through various like inappropriate Holocaust analogies. We saw this a lot during the height of the COVID pandemic, where vaccination regimes were compared to the Nazi regime, as if a vaccination is similar to what Jews experienced in the Holocaust. And it might seem strange to put this in the same category as hardcore Holocaust denialism, but it functions largely in the same way. Because if something like a vaccination mandates, something which is largely no more of an inconvenience than a pinprick, can be rationally and reasonably compared to the Holocaust, then was the Holocaust really the Holocaust? If it's, can be reasonably compared to something that's little more than an inconvenience? No, right? So it has the effect of sort of minimizing the Holocaust and the horrors that it represents. So a few things that I want to impart to you in terms of the sort of the mechanics and dynamics of anti-Semitism to help you understand and recognize it better. So here are 10 things that I think are important to know. First thing, we already mentioned that anti-Semitism is enduring, right? It's been around for a really long time. There's no consensus among scholars when or how or where it began, why it began, but we do know that it has extends back into ancient antiquity. And one of the earliest examples in recorded history can be found in the Torah, right, where a new leader comes to power in Egypt, a new pharaoh, right, who says the people of Israel have become too numerous among us, and if there should befall Egypt any war, they will join with our enemies and rise up against us. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is not a theological quarrel, right? We tend to think of anti-Semitism as having its roots in sort of theological bigotry, right? An anti-religious kind of animus. But here we see already in ancient antiquity that this grievance that Pharaoh has aimed at the Jews is actually, again, one about a national threat. Not that the Jews won't worship our gods or bring sacrifices to our temples, or that they have weird religious beliefs or practices, but rather that Jews are a fifth column, right? That they pose a threat to our nation, that they're going to join with our enemies, betray us in war, that sort of thing, right? Now, this is not only one of the oldest anti-Semitic tropes, it's also one of the most common today. So our research shows that roughly 41% of people around the world believe that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the United States necessarily, that Jews are more loyal to the countries where they live than they are more loyal to Israel than the countries where they live. And in the United States, nearly 4 out of every 10 Americans believe that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the United States, right? So again, this idea of Jewish disloyalty, right? That Jews pose a threat to the nation and its way of life, right? Its existence, its constitution, etc., is a very common and a very old anti-Jewish trope. Number two, part of the reason that anti-Semitism has been able to survive for millennia is because of its incredible ability to adapt to its environment, right? Like a biological organism that survives by adapting to its environment, so too does anti-Semitism tend to shapeshift and take on forms that allow it to adapt to various different social, political, religious, and other contexts. And to carry the particular weight, the particular power that is relevant in that context, right? So it will, like a chameleon, it will tend to take the form that carries the greatest currency in that particular, from that ideological vantage point in that particular context, right? Now, because that's true, because anti-Semitism isn't one thing, but is constantly shape-shifting and taking different forms, the grievances that are mobilized against Jews, or the justifications for why Jews are being attacked or exploited or oppressed, can oftentimes seem paradoxical or even contradictory, right? So historically, we've seen Jews being blamed for the failures of capitalism on the one hand, and for the failures of socialism or communism on the other. Jews are hated on the one hand for being too pacifistic, for being unwilling to defend their nation, and on the other hand for being too militaristic, right? For being warmongers and bloodthirsty and so on. In some ideological quarters, Jews are hated for being too nationalistic, right? And in other ideological quarters, for being unpatriotic, for being rootless cosmopolitans with no allegiance to any nation, any people, anybody. On the one hand, Jews are hated for being racists and ethnic supremacists, and in other quarters for promoting multiculturalism, right? Jews are hated for being too insular on one hand, for only sticking to their own kind and only caring what happens to other Jews, and in other quarters for being a threat to purity, racial purity, religious purity, other forms of purity. And of course, we've heard both that Jews should get out of our country and go back to Israel, Palestine, and on the other hand, from a different ideological vantage point, the Jews should get out of Israel, Palestine. Right. So depending on what ideological vantage point, what your politics are, what your religious inclination is, there's a form of anti-Semitism for you. Right. There's always anti-Semitism will always dress for the occasion. Right. Will always take the form that carries the greatest power among those that it's trying to influence. Number 4, anti-Semitism can be conscious and overt, but more often than not, I would say it's unconscious and implicit, right? So anti-Semitism, like other forms of bigotry, have been sort of an undercurrent in our society, and sometimes not an undercurrent, very much on the surface. But it is sort of, over the centuries, it has pervaded all the systems, structures, institutions, social dynamics, cultural norms, et cetera, of our society, of our civilization. And so therefore, it's almost part of the air we breathe, right? We're swimming in this environment that is suffused with these ideas, these ideological structures. And so as a result of that, oftentimes we don't even recognize that we've internalized some of these ideas and ideological structures. So it's not our fault, right? It's not our fault that we've been infected with this, but it is our responsibility to critically self-analyze, understand the ideas that we have internalized, and to begin to dismantle and heal from that virus so that we don't further infect others and pass that virus on. So in other words, just because no intent was that there was no anti-Jewish intent doesn't mean that there was no anti-Jewish harm. That's really important to understand, right? That because anti-Semitism operates often in an unconscious way, anti-Jewish animus, right, a hatred towards Jews is not necessary, is not a necessary precondition for anti-Semitism to be present, right? So we have to center impact, right, and not only look at intent, right? Because people will oftentimes defend themselves by saying, I don't hate anybody, I don't have any hatred in my heart. It's not about hatred, right? It's about the impact that certain ideas have on our behavior, and both as individuals and also as civic creatures who vote on policies and that sort of thing. Number 5, anti-Semitism is a racialized bigotry, right? It's not merely a sort of anti-religious prejudice, as we've seen, right? But is actually has for centuries taken a racialized form, right? So what does that mean? It means that the Jew of the anti-Semitic imagination is constructed not merely as a religious other, as having different theological or spiritual beliefs, but as a racial other, imbued with certain racial characteristics that are both physical, but also crucially relating to character, relating to the value of human beings, right? So racism, the very concept of race, was created not simply to taxonomize the human family, but actually to create a hierarchy of human beings, right? And Jews were among the first peoples to be racialized, right? And this particular form of anti-Semitism, this racialized biological form of anti-Semitism, which ascribes to Jews these immutable physical but also character traits, allows Jews no possibility to escape their condition through conversion, right? Because it's not about what you believe, it's not how you worship. It's really about these innate qualities that are fixed, immutable. They're tied to your biology. It doesn't matter if you convert out of the religion; you're still a Jew, right? The Nazis didn't go around asking people, what they believe, how they worship, or what God or whatever. They didn't care. If you had one Jewish grandparent, you were marked for death. Number 6, anti-Semitism, although it is a racialized bigotry, although it has elements of racial, of religious prejudice and so on, it's much more than just a social prejudice. And in its most virulent and I would say dangerous form, anti-Semitism takes the form of a conspiracy theory. Again, a conspiracy theory usually having to do with these notions of Jewish power, control, domination, exploitation, etc. Right? The view of Jews as an inordinate and malicious power in the world. Right? Now, this often manifests in political terms, right? Like many forms of bigotry, anti-Semitism often is political. It's expressed in political terms, right? And that's really important to understand because, again, many people will try to defend their anti-Semitism by making references to political ideology. This isn't bigotry. These are just my political views. Not so fast, right? Because bigotry of various kinds is oftentimes expressed in political terms. The movement to undermine the bodily autonomy of women is a political movement. The anti-immigrant movement is a political movement. The Nazi Party was a political party, right? So you can't get, there's no get out of jail free card by simply, saying that these are my political views. They can be your political views and still be racist, can still be bigoted. And these political forms of anti-Semitism have often been wielded by folks across the political and ideological spectrum. Anti-Semitism has no inherent political locus. It's not a right-wing problem. It's not a left-wing problem. It really finds fertile soil across the ideological spectrum, and has been wielded as a political tool in pursuit of political goals by regimes, individuals, movements across the political spectrum. But the fight against anti-Semitism must never, ever be politicized, right? We hear this all the time where people constantly are pointing across the aisle and insisting that, the real problem with anti-Semitism is over there with those people who hold those beliefs. And what we should hear when we hear people talking like that is what they're really saying is it's somebody else's problem. And we really can't afford that. We really need people to take responsibility over their own domain, those places where they have responsibility and where they're best positioned to have an impact, right? Do the work there rather than pointing at your neighbor's backyard and how dirty it is. Clean up your own backyard first. Right, and we see the way that this works across the political and ideological spectrum. Here's one example of that, right? That emerged during COVID. This notion that that we can't take care of our people, real Americans, quote unquote, because the Jews are, sort of siphoning all our hard-earned tax dollars and sending it to Israel. And here you see two political cartoons, one from the far right, I pulled it from a white supremacist site, one from the far left, essentially saying the same thing, right? We can't take care of our people, right? Because the Jews are stealing all our money and sending it to the Jewish state. Number 8, anti-Semitism has many different manifestations, from microaggressions to all the way to mass murder, right? And that's really important to understand that anti-Semitism ultimately is lethal. Left unchecked, it will tend to escalate, right, into more and more pernicious and deadly forms. Right. So some of the ways that we hear people talking about anti-Semitism, you'd think that the biggest problem with it is that it hurts Jewish feelings. That's not what this is about. Right. Anti-Semitism puts Jewish lives at risk and has many different harms that we can identify throughout the centuries and right up until our time today. Anti-Semitism has always been lethal. Usually when we think about the lethality of anti-Semitism, our minds go to the Holocaust for good reason. But it has always been lethal. You can find accounts in ancient antiquity, for example, of pogroms that swept across ancient Alexandria in Egypt. You can find accounts of pogroms in the late 1800s in the part of the world that I come from, in the Pale of Settlement, right? That already decades before the Holocaust were claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. Of Jewish lives, right? So, and right up until our time today, right, when Jews are still being murdered in their synagogues, in their places of worship, in their community centers, and around the world. Number 9, anti-Semitism isn't really about Jews, right? So the Jew of the anti-Semitic imagination is it's a psychological construct. It's a product of the non-Jewish imagination. That is a fantasy. It's a caricature. It has nothing to do with Jews as they actually exist, as they actually behave. But rather, this caricature, this projection, it's largely representative of the collective fears, prejudices, anxieties, feelings of dislocation, disenfranchisement, alienation, and so on of the non-Jewish collective, right? So it's ideas, misgivings, sentiments that get then projected onto Jews, who become the embodiment of all that is wrong with our society, all that is wrong with our world, politically, economically, culturally, or in any other way. And number 10, anti-Semitism is a canary in the coal mine, right? So what does that mean? It means that anti-Semitism is a kind of bellwether that is indicative of a malady in our society, right? Because when you study anti-Semitism historically, what you find is that it never shows up on the scene alone. It always comes with an entourage of other anti-democratic, anti-social, and anti-intellectual phenomena. Authoritarianism, the erosion of democratic norms, the attack on democratic governance, democratic institutions, a kind of anti-intellectualism that breeds contempt for scholarship, for knowledge, for expertise, for learning and science, right? And the consequent proliferation of various kinds of conspiracy theories and the propagation of other forms of bigotry and xenophobia, which we've all seen in our own time, right, in the recent years. Even as we've seen this explosion of anti-Semitic incidents, that has been in parallel with a rising hate crimes against other communities and the normalization and really mainstreaming of a whole bunch of different kinds of conspiracy theories, from QAnon to various kinds of COVID conspiracy theories, and so on. This is not by accident. This is part of the structure, part of the blueprint of how anti-Semitism tends to operate. Now, I see I'm coming up on time, so I'm just going to fast forward a little bit and conclude by speaking very quickly about the fact that anti-Semitism, properly understood, is part of a broader matrix of oppression, right? That it is related to, it's interconnected with other forms of bigotry or oppression, like anti-Blackness, LGBTQ phobia, Islamophobia, and so on, right? And each of these needs to be understood in their particularity, the things that make them unique and distinct, because after all, anti-Semitism doesn't function exactly like sexism, which doesn't function exactly like anti-Blackness. They all have things that make them unique. They mobilize a unique set of tropes or ideas against the targeted group. They operate in different ways. They have different dynamics, and they also share many things in common and have an interplay. They feed off of each other. They are mutually reinforcing systems of oppression, right? And need to be understood not only unto themselves in their particularity, but also in their commonality and interplay, right? And so the last thing I'll just say is that there's many things we can say about the commonalities among these, right? They homogenize diverse communities of people, deny them their individuality, they scapegoat people for social problems, and so on. There's many different commonalities that we can talk about. But there's also something that makes anti-Semitism distinct from other forms of bigotry or oppression, and that is this conspiracist aspect of it, right? Anti-Semitism alleges to punch up at its targets, whereas other bigotries will allege to be punching down at a group of inferiors, right? So in order to properly understand any form of bigotry, you have to climb into the head of the bigot. And if you climb into the head of a sexist or an anti-Black racist, what you'll find is that they generally regard the targets of their bigotry as being inferior to them, right? Not as smart, not as beautiful, not as industrious, not as good in some way, right? Anti-Semitism also has this aspect, right? It regards Jews as morally inferior. They're greedy, they're avaricious, dishonest, etc. Maybe aesthetically inferior. They're not as beautiful as the European phenotype or what have you. But it also holds that Jews are inordinately powerful, right? Capable of controlling the global media, the financial system, the foreign policy of the United Nations, and even the weather, we've heard, right? And so that leads people to scapegoat the Jewish community for any number of different political, economic, and other problems, right? If Jews are really this powerful, then you can really blame them as being behind anything and everything that is going wrong with the world. All right, so with that, I'm going to wrap up here and pass it over to my colleague, Tema. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vlad, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I know this is a really challenging topic, and it's something that I think all of us are spending a huge amount of time thinking about right now. And what I want to spend a little bit of time doing is, Vlad just gave a lot of information, context, history, and I want to pivot a little bit to thinking about where we are at in the moment, how we can respond, and where we can support each other, whether we are ourselves Jewish, working inside the Jewish community, or as folks who are working with us who may not be Jewish, folks who have family that may not be Jewish, and all of us within our communities. So first things first, I want to start by just affirming the fact that I think for a lot of us, the moment is I was reading some of the questions that had come in the registration forms, and for a lot of us, we're really asking the question, what next? Where do we go from here? What do we do about our relationships, our coalitions, the work that we've been doing on things that we deeply believe in, where maybe we're not feeling that reciprocated at this moment. So I want to start, first of all, by saying that those feelings, I think, are extremely valid. One of the ways that I've been describing the moment that we're in is that we're in a moment of paradigm shift. And I don't think any of us know what it looks like on the other end. This is a conversation that we're having internally at ADL around work that we do, partnerships that we have, relationships that we've built, of where do we go from here? What are the causes that we will continue to show up for because they are important to us in and of themselves? And what do we do about relationships that have really fractured and fragmented? I hope that as Vlad was going through some of the content of his presentation, you were thinking of how some of those historic themes relate to some of those things where we're really seeing the fraying, those internalized pieces of anti-Semitism. So, for example, really fresh on my mind is the denial of sexual assault and sexual violence that was experienced by Israeli women and potentially also Israeli men on October 7th. And some of those pieces about expecting dual loyalty, expecting dishonesty, really without necessarily rising to the surface of people's thought processes, are allowing people to ask the question. The idea that somehow Jews are in this for nefarious ends, are more loyal to Israel, is leading people to ask questions that are frankly disgusting and shocking. So this is all, the context that we're working in, and part of the job of anti-Semitism education is to look at that and try and figure out, like, how do we continue to do the work of unpacking these anti-Semitic tropes that have lasted for thousands of years when they're really surfacing and fraying our coalitions, relationships, friendships, and many other pieces. I will end with some pieces of like concrete things that we can do both to support each other and for folks who are allies of the Jewish community able to do. And I want to make sure that there's time for questions because I'm sure there will be many. But I really wanted to start there. And I remind myself every day right now that the causes that I believe in, the people I have showed up for where I don't share an identity, I don't do it because I expect anything back. I show up for the causes that I believe in because I believe in the dignity of even people who might be anti-Semitic. I believe that every single person is deserving of equal rights and dignity and a right to life and to freedom and so on and so forth. So really, that's something, it's a mantra that I am bringing every time I sort of see people who, or organizations that I have believed in, put things out that are challenging in the moment. I know we can talk endlessly about, the situation on the ground in Israel, Palestine. That's not really what we're here to do. And I want to sort of foreground that because what really we're talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitism is the ways in which the reactions to the situation on the ground have undercurrents of anti-Semitism. No matter who's right and who's wrong, who has power and who doesn't, it's those places where it is complicated and difficult for those of us who are saying, there's anti-Semitism here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do and pull up one slide, and then we will dive into Q&A. So what we do at ADL, we do a whole bunch of things. And my work is specifically in partnering with Jewish community organizations. And we've been working really across the landscape, from sort of liberal, unaffiliated organizations. Like, I'm really excited we're doing work with my former place of employment, 18 Doors, all the way through to working with NCSY, the Orthodox Youth Movement, and so on and so forth, really giving Jews and their loved ones the tools to talk about what is anti-Semitism, how does it function, and how can we show up in this moment. We run a synagogue engagement project called Kulanu, and all of this will be in the resources that we send out. And I'm going to make sure that we send out a whole bunch of resources on how to actually have conscientious conversations right now when the emotions are high. I'm going to flag that many of them say that they're for campus. These are resources that we put together for campus initially, but the tips and tricks and tools in them are phenomenal, no matter if you're a student or just having a tense Hanukkah dinner with family on one side or the other of the political spectrum. I'm going to share one slide with just some really concrete tips on showing up for each other and showing up as allies, and then we'll dive into the Q&A. So very briefly, we've put together these 10 ways to be an ally against anti-Semitism. And as I said, we put this together in an allyship context, but the reality is that this is also for Jews to be there in this moment and support each other. 10 really wonderful tools and tricks. Learn. I learn something new about anti-Semitism, Jews, Judaism, Jewish history all the time. And I work in the field. So for all of us, this is something that we can continue to do. Educate, create opportunities to engage and educate others, share quality resources, have interesting and difficult conversations. Reach out. I love when people have reached out to me and said, how's it going? How are you doing? Whether that's colleagues in other Jewish organizations, friends who are Jewish and not Jewish, and so on and so forth. Show up. If going to rallies and solidarity events are your kind of a thing, do it. Uplift Jewish voices on and offline, disrupt anti-Semitism whenever and wherever and in whatever form you see it, but safety first. Report. So if you see things, report them. You can report them to us at ADL, to social media platforms. We know that sometimes the enforcement is not great, but it's still important to continue to report. Or if it's a crime, law enforcement. Advocate for inclusive policies and language in the workplace. We're going to include Shine a Light, which is an initiative going on right now. There's a bunch of really phenomenal workplace resources that you can share out with friends, family, and even some of our Jewish organizations could benefit from actually concretizing some of these policies that we recommend. And engage where you feel you can have an impact. And lastly, support each other, ourselves, and that can be emotional support, it can be resources, and it can also be financial support where appropriate. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can dive into some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Tema and Vlad, for your historical overview and your remarks around how we can all show up as allies in these situations. Feel free to keep either putting your questions into the Q&A section on Zoom or to send them directly to me in the chat. One of the questions that has come up, which I would like to ask you to address, is related to the current climate in Israel today, and how do we draw lines between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Tema, you want me to take this one? Do you want to take it?
Why don't you take it first and I'll jump in after.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So look, Israel is a government like any other government. Governments should be scrutinized, should be held to account, and where necessary should be criticized. That is certainly true of the Israeli government. And if you want to see really robust critiques of the Israeli government, you need only go so far as the Israeli press, because that is where some of the most pointed critiques of Israeli policies, politicians, and so on will be found. So nothing inherently wrong with criticizing Israel, but it does matter how you go about doing that, right? So if your quote unquote critique of Israel is suffused with anti-Semitic ideas, tropes, symbols, images, associations, etc. If your understanding of Zionism is distorted through an anti-Semitic lens that leads you to see Zionism as something more akin to the plot described in the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion than any actually existing Zionist literature, that's anti-Semitism, right? One resource that I will point you all to is the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. It's a mouthful, but that is the most widely adopted, widely embraced framework. Some people call it a definition. I'll call it a framework for understanding anti-Semitism. The definitional part of the framework is not so helpful. It's like very vague, right? Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews. I think as somebody once joked, I always thought that anti-Semitism was an uncertain perception of Jews, which I think is right. But what's really useful about the IRA definition is that it has a certain set of examples of how anti-Semitism can manifest relative to Israel, to Zionism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, and that includes things like double standards, right? Applying to Israel a different set of standards than you would to other countries. Demonization, right? Using those classic tropes associated with anti-Semitism, and delegitimization, the idea that Jews, do not deserve the right to self-determination that others enjoy under international law, the right to statehood, that Israel has no right to exist. And by the way, this notion, right, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, right, that we have said very clearly at ADL and that many people have taken issue with, that's actually a very common understanding of anti-Semitism. 9 out of every 10 Jews, and roughly the same number of Americans more generally, believe that the statement, Israel has no right to exist, in other words, anti-Zionism, is anti-Semitic. Right, so that's a very, certainly a representative belief in the Jewish community and among Americans more broadly. Tema, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add on to that. I think, one of the things about the moment that we're in right now, and seeing how some of a significant amount of what is coming out as sort of criticism of Israel in anti-Zionist quarters, is that it's becoming easier and easier to see the blurring between those two things, because so much of the language of what we're seeing draws from historic tropes or questions the honesty of the Jewish accounts of what happened on October 7th or something like that. It gets really murky, and I think this is really where things are heated and tense when people have different ideas for the outcome of this specific conflict. And I think that's where things are getting very tense and murky and heated. And we need to learn to sit and listen to each other and really have those conversations from the different sides that we're on. But I think the most important thing to remember is anti-Zionism, when we're talking about that, is essentially it's a philosophy of negation, that Israel does not have a right to exist. It is not saying, Israel should not, the Israeli government should not enact this or that policy. And I think we have to really be really clear about what that means when we're talking about it, and really push. That's a place to push on somebody. There is, I think we use the term anti-Zionism sometimes colloquially very broadly, and so to really understand what is underlying somebody's beliefs in this moment, I think this is a great moment. There was, not that I read the Wall Street Journal, but my mother sent me an article because she gets everything in her news feed and just sends it all to me because she thinks I want to read every single thing written about anti-Semitism that ever happens. She will kill me for saying that about her, but that's the truth. And there was this thing where they actually did some polling of people, and which sort of, it started out, of course, with like which river and which sea, right? And most people couldn't answer, but it actually goes through a number of sort of slogans and catchphrases, and actually pushes one line beyond the slogan and catchphrase. And the reality is most people are just not that informed. And so that's something that I think we really need to take into account here when we're having these complicated conversations, is that most people are not as informed as the people who care deeply on one side or another. And then also, obviously, people have different interpretations of terminology, of history, and so on and so forth. So really being able to have those conversations feels really key to me right now.
Thank you, Tema, and thank you, Vlad. As a follow-up to that comment around being aware of the terminology and how things are being said, a couple of people have asked about how to respond or how to address Jewish sentiments of anti-Zionism. And maybe, I don't know if that's related to internalized anti-Semitism, or can you comment a little bit on that phenomenon?
Sure. Tema, you want to go first? You want me to go?
I mean, one thing that I will say, and this is not specifically on the anti-Zionism piece, but yes, Jews can demonstrate anti-Semitic beliefs, whether it is internalized anti-Semitism, or whether it's that all of it would be internalized anti-Semitism because of the nature of the beast. But we internalize the tropes that we live among. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism is quite present in our culture and society, and has been over generations. And yes, therefore we absorb it. And sometimes we turn that into comedy gold. And sometimes we turn that into things that are maybe a little bit more shame driven, or driven, or things that put people in conflict with each other. I'm going to pass it to Vlad, because I know Vlad can speak personally a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, right, like internalized oppression is a real phenomenon. Whether we're talking about internalized anti-Semitism or any other form of oppression, the targeted group always has folks among it who will internalize these ideas, because, as Tema said, we live in this society that conditions us to think about the world in certain ways, right? And that's the other piece, right? When we're talking about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, I think where people, get it wrong or misunderstand is that when somebody says anti-Semitism, they're looking for hatred. They're looking for animus, somebody who is hostile towards Jewish people. And I think, we define anti-Semitism that way sometimes as a shorthand, right? Anti-Semitism means Jew hatred. And it doesn't really, right? Because again, anti-Semitism operates independent of sentiment and feeling, right? It's not really just about hate. Certainly anti-Semitism can lead people to hate Jews, but really the proper way to understand anti-Semitism, and I would offer most other forms of bigotry, is actually as an analytical model, as an interpretive framework to try to understand the world, to try to understand geopolitics, economics, etc. And it's really what it is a poor substitute for knowledge, for rigorous analysis, right, for erudition. As Tema said, most people don't know much about the conflict, about Zionism, about Jews, or much else, right? Only about 60% of Americans can identify that Israel is even in the Middle East. Most can't find it on a map. Half of Americans haven't heard of Zionism. Most can't define it properly, right? And those who can, by the way, those who can define it properly have lower rates of anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel. So knowledge is a factor here. Right, but it's really about a certain way of viewing the world, much more than it is anti-Semitism. But we have to remember that anti-Zionism, the first manifestations of anti-Zionism, were actually within the Jewish community, right? Because this was inside baseball, right? These were Jews discussing primarily how to keep Jews safe. Right. Remember, anti-Semitism, Zionism came, into the world during a time of tremendous bloody anti-Semitism, right? Again, pogroms were sweeping across the Pale of Settlement in the late 1800s, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews. And Zionism, in part, emerged as a response to that, right? And so, this was an internal debate among Jews about the best way to keep Jews safe, right? And some people said, like, listen, we have no future here. These people are never going to be able to protect us or keep us safe, right? We need our own society, our own army, so that we can take our own safety into our own hands. Other Jews disagreed. They said, no, we can stay here and create a safe society for Jews right here in the diaspora, right? It was an internal debate about people whose primary interest was, how do we keep Jews safe? That is very different from the anti-Zionism that we see today. And yes, some of the anti-Zionism we see within the Jewish community is a factor of internalized anti-Semitism, right? There's also just different people with different political opinions. Some people say, I don't believe in nation states at all. I'm an anarchist. I don't believe that there should be any borders. So yes, no state for the Jews, but also no state for the Palestinians or the Brits or the Koreans or the Ethiopians or anything else. That's a different view on it. And so, by the way, are religious forms of anti-Zionism, right? Just earlier this week, the head of the Satmar movement on Twitter reprimanded somebody who tried to suggest that their anti-Zionism was similar to the political anti-Zionism of the people protesting in front of Jewish businesses and vandalizing Jewish synagogues. And he said, no, ours are based in theological beliefs and we find contemptible these people who are engaging in this way, attacking Jews, etc. This is not our anti-Zionism.
Vlad, thank you so much. This is as I expected, there's so much more to unpack than we have time for today. So I want to thank you very much for all the information you shared and for shedding some insight into what we're all witnessing. Again, all of the resources will be shared with you after today's program, and my colleague is going to put a short evaluation form into the chat that you can fill out, which will help us design any future programs. I appreciate all of you being here for this important conversation, and a big thank you to Vlad and Tema.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day.